Hey, get away from my car. Victoria's head snapped up, her dark eyes meeting his across 15 feet of cooling asphalt. She'd been walking back from the corner store when she heard the telltale hiss of an overheating engine and followed her instincts to help. I don't care what you think is wrong. Daniel's voice carried the sharp edge of a man whose control was slipping. This is a $200,000 car, and you have no business touching it. Ready for the complete story? Smash that subscribe button and tell me where you are tuning in from in the comments. Tomorrow brings another mind-blowing story that's just as unbelievable. Trust me, you will want to be here for it. Alright, let's jump into it. The October rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hartwell Industries' executive suite, 43 stories above Manhattan's relentless pulse. Daniel Hartwell stood motionless, watching droplets race down the glass like tears he'd forgotten how to shed. At 38, he commanded a tech empire worth $800 million, yet the reflections staring back at him looked hollow, carved from expensive suits and empty victories. His phone buzzed, the 14th call from his assistant about the charity gala. Another evening of forced smiles, strategic handshakes, and conversations that skated across the surface of everything meaningful. Daniel's fingers found the platinum wedding ring he still wore, though Patricia had been gone for 2 years now. Not dead, worse. Gone to someone who actually listened when she spoke. Mr. Hartwell? His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Your car is waiting. Daniel straightened his Italian silk tie and grabbed his briefcase. The elevator descended through floors of busy lives he'd never bothered to know, carrying him toward another perfectly orchestrated evening that would leave him feeling more alone than before. Across town, Victoria Wright's weathered hands moved with surgical precision beneath the hood of a 1994 Honda Civic. Grease had long since become part of her fingerprints, and the smell of motor oil was sweeter than any perfume. At 35, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned every skill through necessity, not privilege. Mrs. Wright, you're a miracle worker, whispered Elena, the young mother whose car Victoria had been nursing back to life for the past hour. I can't afford much, but you pay what you can, when you can, Victoria replied, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who understood struggle intimately. She'd learned mechanics from her grandfather in his cramped Queens garage, where love was expressed through teaching patient hands to coax life from dying engines. Victoria wiped her hands on a rag that had seen 1,000 repairs. Through the garage's open bay door, she watched expensive cars glide past on their way to Manhattan's glittering district. Different worlds, she'd learned long ago. Some people drove cars worth more than her yearly income, and they usually looked right through her when their paths accidentally crossed. She didn't know that tonight, those worlds were about to collide in ways that would change everything. The October evening had dressed Manhattan in its finest autumn coat when Daniel's Mercedes S-Class purred to a stop outside the Metropolitan Museum. The charity gala's red carpet stretched like a river of impossible elegance, but Daniel felt nothing but the familiar weight of performance settling on his shoulders. He stepped from his car, straightening his tuxedo, when his phone erupted with an urgent call from Tokyo. Crisis. Always crisis. As he paced, gesturing sharply while negotiating a deal worth millions, he barely noticed when his driver pulled away to park the Mercedes in the museum's exclusive lot. 20 minutes later, deal salvaged, Daniel walked toward where his car should have been waiting. Instead, he found empty asphalt and a growing knot of panic. The gala reception was starting, investors were waiting, and somewhere in this maze of Manhattan streets, his car had vanished. He spotted it 3 blocks away, pulled to the curb with its hood raised like a surrender flag. Steam escaped from the engine bay in ghostly wisps, and Daniel's perfectly ordered evening crumbled around him. But it wasn't the broken car that stopped his breath. It was the woman leaning over his engine, a black woman in coveralls, her hands deep in his $250,000 machine's mechanical heart. Something primal and protective roared to life in Daniel's chest, overriding reason. "Hey, get away from my car." Victoria's head snapped up, her dark eyes meeting his across 15 feet of cooling asphalt. She'd been walking back from the corner store when she heard the telltale hiss of an overheating engine and followed her instincts to help. Now, faced with a man in a tuxedo who looked at her like she was stealing his soul, she slowly straightened. "Your radiator hose is blown," she said calmly, wiping her hands on a clean rag. Car was about to seize up completely. "I don't care what you think is wrong." Daniel's voice carried the sharp edge of a man whose control was slipping. "This is a $200,000 car, and you have no business touching it." The words hung in the air between them like a blade. Victoria had heard variations of this song her entire life. The assumption that her presence meant trouble, that her knowledge meant nothing, that her help was really harm in disguise. But tonight, something in his tone cut deeper than usual. "Sir," she said, her voice steady as steel, "I was trying to prevent your engine from destroying itself. But you're right, it's your car." She stepped back, hands raised slightly, and Daniel saw something in her eyes that made his stomach twist. Not anger, though she had every right to it. Resignation. The bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been here before, too many times to count. Around them, curious galagoers began to gather, phones already emerging. Daniel realized he was about to become a viral video, the privileged CEO exploding at a Good Samaritan. His PR team would have nightmares for weeks. But it was too late to take back the words that had already escaped. Too late to undo the look of quiet pain that flickered across Victoria's face before she turned to walk away. Daniel stood alone beside his broken car, watching her disappear into the crowd, and for the first time in years, his wealth felt like the heaviest burden he'd ever carried. Victoria had made it exactly half a block when the sound stopped her cold. Metal grinding against metal, the mechanical death rattle she'd heard too many times to ignore. Behind her, Daniel's Mercedes shuddered once and fell silent, steam now billowing like a white flag of surrender. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her grandfather's voice. "Baby girl, when you hear a machine crying for help, you don't walk away. Not ever. That's not who we are." Against every instinct for self-preservation, Victoria turned around. Daniel stood beside his dead car, like a general surveying a lost battlefield. His phone was pressed to his ear, voice escalating with each failed attempt to reach his driver, his mechanic, anyone who could restore order to his unraveling evening. The gala's golden lights beckoned from 3 blocks away, but he might as well have been stranded on Mars. "I don't care what it costs. I need someone here in 10 minutes. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Victoria caught something she hadn't expected: desperation. She approached slowly, hands visible, like approaching a wounded animal. "Sir!" Daniel spun around, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. "What do you want? Haven't you done enough?" The accusation hit like a slap, but Victoria had developed thick skin over 35 years of being blamed for things that weren't her fault. "Your engine's seized. That grinding sound. Your pistons just welded themselves to your cylinder walls. Without immediate attention, you're looking at a complete engine replacement, maybe $60,000–$70,000. Daniel's face went ashen. "That's impossible. This car is barely 6 months old. Age doesn't matter when you ignore warning signs." Victoria's voice held no judgment, just the calm certainty of expertise. "The radiator hose I mentioned? It's been leaking coolant for weeks, probably. Small leak at first, barely noticeable. But tonight, in this heat, with the stop-and-go traffic." She gestured at the steam still rising from his engine bay. "Perfect storm." Something in her tone made Daniel really look at her for the first time. She wasn't just some random woman who'd happened upon his car. The way she stood, the confidence in her diagnosis, the casual way she'd identified problems that his high-end mechanic had missed during the last service. This wasn't luck or coincidence. "Who are you?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice held curiosity instead of accusation. Someone who knows engines. Victoria pulled a small flashlight from her jacket pocket, its beam revealing the devastating truth in the Mercedes' mechanical heart. Someone who could have prevented this if you'd listened instead of assumed. The words stung because they were true. Daniel's jaw worked silently as the reality settled in. His prejudice had cost him not just money, but the chance to avoid this disaster entirely. Can you? He stopped, pride warring with desperation. Is there anything that can be done? Victoria studied him for a long moment, seeing past the expensive tuxedo to the man underneath. She recognized that particular brand of fear. Not the fear of losing money, but the fear of losing control, of being exposed as less capable than the world believed. Maybe, she said quietly. But not here, and not like this. You need a proper garage, tools, parts. She paused, then made a decision that surprised them both. I know a place. 20 minutes from here. Owner's a friend of mine. Daniel's phone had gone silent in his hand. The gala, the investors, the carefully choreographed evening. All of it suddenly seemed less important than the quiet certainty in this woman's voice. Why? He asked. Why would you help me after what I said? Victoria's smile was sad, but not bitter. Because that engine didn't deserve what just happened to it. And because. She hesitated, then continued with devastating honesty. Because I've been where you are right now. Not with money or cars, but standing in a place where everything I thought I controlled was falling apart, and I had to choose between pride and survival. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Daniel felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, but opening, like a window that had been painted shut for years suddenly giving way to fresh air. What's your name? He asked. Victoria Wright. Daniel Hartwell. He extended his hand, and when she took it, her calloused palm against his soft one felt like the most honest handshake he'd experienced in years. Nice to meet you, Daniel Hartwell, Victoria said. Now, do you want to save your car, or do you want to keep standing here while it finishes dying? For the first time in months, Daniel laughed. A real laugh, not the polished performance he wore to board meetings. I think I'd like to save it. Victoria nodded toward the street where a taxi was approaching. Then let's go save something tonight. As they climbed into the cab together, a millionaire CEO and a master mechanic, still strangers but no longer enemies. Neither realized they were about to discover that some forms of rescue work both ways. The taxi pulled away from the curb, carrying them toward a garage where more than engines would be repaired, where two souls who'd forgotten how to trust would begin to remember what it felt like to be truly seen. Behind them, Daniel's broken Mercedes sat silent under the streetlights. But for the first time in years, its owner wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what he might be about to find. The taxi's interior felt smaller with each passing block, the silence between Daniel and Victoria thick with unspoken questions. Daniel stared out the window at the city lights blurring past, his mind racing to process what had just happened. In 38 years of life, he'd never climbed into a stranger's solution to his problems. He solved things. He controlled outcomes. He didn't trust people he'd just met. His phone buzzed with increasingly frantic texts from the gala. Where are you? Investors asking for you. PR disaster brewing. Each message felt like a weight added to his chest, reminding him that his entire world was built on maintaining an image of perfection. Second thoughts. Victoria's voice was quiet, understanding. No, Daniel said too quickly, then caught himself. Maybe. This is. He gestured vaguely at the space between them. I don't usually trust strangers who've seen you at your worst. Victoria's tone held no judgment, but Daniel felt the sting anyway. He turned to face her fully for the first time since they'd gotten in the cab. In the intermittent glow of streetlights, he could see details he'd missed in his earlier panic. The intelligence in her dark eyes, The quiet strength in how she held herself, the small scar on her chin that spoke of a life lived without protective barriers. "I wasn't at my worst," he said defensively. Victoria's eyebrow arched slightly. "Screaming at someone who was trying to help you? That was a good day." The question hit like a diagnosis he didn't want to hear. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. That car represents—" "A symbol," Victoria interrupted gently. "I get it. My grandfather's tools are the same for me. But symbols don't run when their engines seize up." Daniel fell silent, stung by the simple truth of it. In his world, everything was about perception, image, the careful construction of success. But sitting in this cab, heading toward a garage he'd never heard of with a woman whose last name he'd learned 5 minutes ago, all his carefully built walls felt suddenly fragile. Victoria watched the internal war playing out across his features and recognized it. The battle between who someone thought they had to be and who they actually were underneath. She'd fought that same war for years, just with different weapons. "Look," she said, pulling out her phone. "I can call you another cab. Take you back to your party. You can deal with the car tomorrow, through proper channels. Insurance, dealership mechanics, people who look like what you expect expertise to look like." The offer was genuine, delivered without sarcasm or bitterness, which somehow made it worse. Daniel realized she was giving him an escape route from the uncomfortable truth that he needed her. Needed someone he'd judged and dismissed within seconds of meeting. "No," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Victoria studied his face in the passing light. "You sure? Because where we're going, it's not your world. And I can't promise you'll be comfortable with what you see." Daniel's pride flared. "I can handle anything your world has to offer." "It's not about handling it," Victoria said quietly. "It's about respecting it. There's a difference." The taxi turned onto a street lined with auto shops and late-night diners, neon signs reflecting off wet pavement like watercolor paint. Daniel's phone continued its relentless buzzing. His assistant, the gala coordinator, board members who expected him to be charming investors right now instead of riding through Queens with grease-stained hands. He declined another call, and Victoria noticed. "Important meeting?" she asked. "Everything's important when you're responsible for 800 employees and their families," Daniel said, but there was something hollow in his voice. "If I'm not there, if I'm not perfect, if I show any weakness, the world ends." Victoria's tone was gentle, but the question hung heavy. Daniel looked at her sharply. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." But Daniel wouldn't, because explaining would mean admitting that his entire identity was built on being needed, being indispensable, being the man who never stumbled. And he'd already stumbled tonight in the most public way possible. Victoria sensed his retreat and didn't push. She'd spent enough time around men who'd forgotten how to be vulnerable to recognize the signs. Instead, she turned her attention to the street outside, pointing to a modest garage with warm light spilling from its bay doors. "That's us," she said. Daniel's phone rang again, his ex-wife Patricia. He stared at her name on the screen, remembering how she used to tell him that he'd rather be right than happy, rather be respected than loved. She'd been trying to reach something real in him for years, before she finally gave up. He declined the call. "Someone important?" Victoria asked, noticing his hesitation. "Someone who used to be," Daniel said, and for the first time his carefully controlled mask slipped enough to show the pain underneath. Victoria recognized that particular hurt, the ache of love that had died not from lack of caring, but from lack of connection. She almost reached out to touch his arm, then caught herself. This man was still essentially a stranger, still someone who'd accused her of being a threat to his precious car. But as the taxi pulled up to Wright's Auto Repair, the small garage her grandfather had built and her uncle now ran, Victoria found herself hoping that maybe, just maybe, this night could become something different than either of them expected. "Last chance to change your mind," she said as they both looked at the humble garage that would either save his evening or prove to him just how far from his comfortable world he'd traveled. Daniel stared at the simple building, its hand-painted sign and cluttered bay so different from the sterile perfection of his usual life. Every instinct told him to run, to call another cab, to retreat back to the safety of people who looked like him, thought like him, lived like him. Instead, he opened the taxi door. "Let's save a car," he said, and Victoria smiled for the first time since they'd met. But as they walked toward the garage together, both of them carried their defenses close. Daniel his need to control, Victoria her hard-earned wariness of men who thought they owned the world. Neither was ready to admit that maybe, sometimes, the best salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. The real test was just beginning. The warm yellow light spilling from Wright's auto repair felt like stepping into another universe. The garage bay smelled of honest work, motor oil, metal shavings, and the ghost of 1,000 successful repairs. Hand tools hung in precise order along pegboard walls, and classic soul music drifted from a paint-splattered radio perched on a workbench. "Uncle Tommy?" Victoria called out. "You still here?" A stocky man in his 60s emerged from beneath a lifted pickup truck, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. His weathered face broke into a grin when he saw Victoria, then registered surprise at her well-dressed companion. "V, what brings you by this late?" His eyes shifted to Daniel with the polite wariness of someone who'd learned to read people quickly. "And with company." "Emergency repair," Victoria said simply. "This is Daniel." His Mercedes threw a radiator hose and seized the engine. "He needs help." Tommy's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of a Mercedes, but he simply nodded. "Well, let's take a look. Though I gotta warn you," he looked directly at Daniel. "Parts for luxury cars aren't something I keep lying around. Might take some creative problem-solving." Daniel's phone chose that moment to ring again, the mayor's office. He stared at the screen, reality crashing back over him like cold water. This wasn't just about missing a party. The charity gala was raising funds for youth programs in underserved communities. His absence would be noticed, questioned, potentially damaging to causes that actually mattered. "I need to take this," he said, stepping toward the garage's entrance. "Mr. Hartwell's office," he answered, slipping automatically into his professional voice. "Yes, I understand the mayor is expecting me. There's been an unexpected delay." Victoria and Tommy exchanged glances as they listened to Daniel's half of the conversation. A masterclass in corporate diplomacy, explaining nothing while promising everything. But Victoria noticed something else. The way his shoulders tightened with each reassurance he gave, the slight tremor in his hand as he ran it through his perfectly styled hair. 30 minutes, Daniel said finally, ending the call. "I can buy myself 30 minutes before this becomes a real problem." Tommy whistled low. 30 minutes to rebuild a seized engine? "Son, I appreciate optimism, but—" "Actually," Victoria interrupted, moving to the Mercedes as the tow truck driver positioned it in the bay, "we might not need to rebuild anything." Both men turned to watch as Victoria raised the hood and aimed a work light into the engine compartment. In the bright illumination, she moved with the fluid precision of a surgeon, her hands tracing connections and checking components with practiced efficiency. "The seizure might not be complete," she murmured, more to herself than to them. "If the coolant loss was recent, if we caught it early enough." She looked up at Daniel. "When did you first notice the temperature gauge climbing?" Daniel stared at her blankly. I don't know. I don't usually look at the gauges," Victoria finished. "Right. Most people don't." She turned to Tommy. "Emergency coolant flush kit?" "In the back." "But V, even if the engine's salvageable, we don't have Mercedes-spec coolant, and the radiator hose can be temporarily patched with high-temp tape and universal coolant," Victoria said, already moving toward the supply room. "It's not pretty, but it'll get him where he needs to go." Daniel watched her disappear into the back of the garage, then found himself alone with Tommy, who was studying him with the frank assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading character. "You're the one who yelled at her," Tommy said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Daniel's carefully constructed defenses felt useless here. "I thought she was stealing from you." Tommy nodded slowly. "Yeah, she told me. Also told me she was trying to help." He leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" The directness caught Daniel off guard. In his world, confrontations came wrapped in legal language and corporate politeness. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do." Tommy's voice was matter-of-fact, not accusatory. "My niece is one of the finest mechanics I've ever known. Trained her myself, just like her grandfather trained me. She's got instincts you can't teach, and skills most certified techs would kill for. But she's also a black woman in a world that likes to pretend people like her don't exist." Daniel felt heat rise in his face. "I'm not racist." Tommy's smile was knowing. "Maybe not intentionally. But that girl has been helping broken-down motorists since she was 16 years old, and I'd say about half of them react exactly like you did tonight. Fear first, assumptions second, gratitude last." The observation hit like a punch to the solar plexus. Daniel thought about his board meetings, his country club, his social circles, a careful ecosystem of similarity that rarely challenged his worldview. When had he last been forced to confront his own biases? When had he last been wrong about someone so completely? Victoria emerged from the supply room carrying an armload of equipment, her movements efficient and purposeful. "Okay, here's the situation," she said, setting up her tools. "I can get your engine running again, but it's going to take about an hour of work. Maybe more." Daniel's heart sank. "An hour? The gala will happen without you," Victoria said simply. "The question is whether you want your car fixed, or whether you want to call a tow truck and deal with this tomorrow." Daniel looked at his phone, then at Victoria, then at the engine that represented far more than transportation. It was his armor, his statement, his mobile fortress of success. Without it, he felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with being stranded. "If I stay," he said slowly, "what do I do? I don't know anything about cars." "You learn," Victoria said, pulling on work gloves. "Or you find somewhere comfortable to wait." But there was something in her tone, a subtle challenge that made Daniel realize this was about more than mechanical repair. This was about whether he was willing to step outside the bubble of privilege that had insulated him from real human connection for so long. "I want to learn," he heard himself say. Victoria looked up from the engine, surprise flickering across her features. "It's going to get messy. These clothes." Daniel looked down at his $1,000 tuxedo, then back at her. "It's just a suit." For the first time since they'd met, Victoria's smile reached her eyes. "All right then. Rule number 1. In this garage, your bank account doesn't matter. Your title doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is whether you're willing to listen and learn." Daniel nodded, rolling up his sleeves. "I can do that." "We'll see," Victoria said, but her tone had softened. "Tommy, can you grab him some coveralls? And maybe start a pot of coffee? This is going to be a long night." As Tommy disappeared to find coveralls that might fit a CEO, Victoria began the delicate work of diagnosing whether Daniel's engine could be saved. But she was also diagnosing something else, whether the man standing beside her, looking lost but determined, was worth the risk of believing in. Neither of them knew it yet, but they were both about to discover that some repairs require more than technical skill. Sometimes they require trust. An hour into the repair, Daniel's tuxedo shirt was rolled to his elbows, a smudge of grease decorated his cheek, and his manicured hands held a flashlight steady while Victoria worked magic in the engine's depths. The coffee Tommy had brewed filled the garage with warmth, and something unexpected was happening. Daniel was actually enjoying himself. "There," Victoria said, straightening up with satisfaction. Temporary hose is holding. Now we flush the system and pray the pistons aren't completely welded. She moved to start the engine flush cycle, but her hand brushed against something on the workbench, a framed photograph that made her freeze. Daniel, following her gaze, saw an image of Victoria as a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, standing beside an elderly black man in front of this very garage. Both wore matching coveralls and enormous grins, her small hands holding a wrench nearly as big as her arm. "That's Grandpa Joe," Victoria said softly, her usual confidence wavering. "He built this place from nothing. Taught me everything I know." Daniel studied the photo, seeing the pure joy radiating from the little girl's face. "You look happy." "I was." Victoria's voice carried a weight that made Daniel set down his tools and really listen. "Happiest I've ever been, probably. Those summers working with him. It was the only place I felt like I belonged." "What happened?" Victoria was quiet for so long that Daniel thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, like she was excavating buried pain. "I was 17 when he died. Heart attack, right here in this bay. I found him." She touched the workbench where the photo sat. "Tommy took over the garage, but I was supposed to go to college. Full scholarship to MIT for mechanical engineering." Daniel's breath caught. MIT, one of the most prestigious engineering programs in the world. "That's incredible. You must have been." "I was," Victoria said simply. "But 3 weeks before I was supposed to leave, my mom got sick. Cancer. Aggressive. Someone had to stay, take care of her, help with medical bills." She shrugged, but Daniel could see the cost of that choice etched in the lines around her eyes. College could wait. Cancer couldn't. The garage fell silent except for the gentle hum of machinery and the distant sound of city traffic. Daniel felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of sacrifice he'd never had to make, choices he'd never been forced to consider. "How long?" he asked quietly. 3 years. She fought for 3 years. Victoria's smile was soft and devastating. "By the time she passed, my scholarship was gone, my spot was gone, and I was 21 with a gap in my education that no admissions committee wanted to hear about." Daniel found himself moving closer, drawn by the raw honesty in her voice. "You never went back?" "Applied twice. Got waitlisted, then rejected. Turns out, I was caring for my dying mother. Doesn't carry much weight when you're competing against kids who spent those years building perfect resumes." Victoria's laugh held no bitterness, just acceptance. "So I stayed here. Became the best mechanic I could be. Figured maybe that was enough." But Daniel could hear what she wasn't saying. The dreams deferred, the potential unrealized, the quiet ache of wondering what if. He thought about his own path to success, paved with family connections, Harvard MBA, startup capital from his father's trust fund. Every advantage handed to him, while this woman had earned every skill through necessity and loss. "Victoria," he started, but she was already moving back to the engine, clearly done with the vulnerability. "We should check the coolant levels," she said, her professional mask sliding back into place. But Daniel wasn't ready to let the moment pass. "I'm sorry." Victoria's hands stilled on the engine. "For what?" "For assuming. For judging. For—" He struggled to find words for the growing awareness of his own ignorance. "For never having to choose between my dreams and my family's survival." The honesty in his voice made Victoria look up, really look at him. She saw something she hadn't expected. Not pity, which she would have hated, but recognition. The acknowledgement of a privilege he was only now becoming conscious of. "What about you?" she asked quietly. "What's your story, Daniel Hartwell?" Daniel's instinct was to deflect, to offer the polished biography from his corporate website. But something about this grease-stained garage, about Victoria's unguarded honesty, made him want to tell the truth for once. "I built an empire to fill a hole," he said finally. "My father, he wasn't cruel, exactly. Just absent. Always working, always building, always achieving. Love was conditional on performance. Affection was earned through accomplishment. Daniel's voice grew quieter. I spent 40 years trying to earn approval from a man who died still disappointed in me. Victoria's expression softened. What did he want that you couldn't give him? Perfection, Daniel said simply. And when I finally achieved everything he demanded, the company, the money, the status, I realized I'd become him. Patricia, my ex-wife, she used to say I'd forgotten how to be human somewhere along the way. Is that why she left? Daniel nodded, the admission scraping his throat raw. She said loving me was like loving a beautiful statue. Impressive to look at, but cold to touch. The words hung in the warm garage air, more honest than anything Daniel had said in years. Victoria saw him clearly now. Not the arrogant CEO who'd yelled at her on the street, but a man who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten how to find the door. Tommy, Victoria called to her uncle, who'd been pretending not to listen while organizing tools. How long on that engine flush? 20 more minutes, at least, Tommy replied. Coffee's fresh if anyone wants some. Victoria nodded, then surprised Daniel by sitting on a nearby crate and patting another one beside her. Sit, rest your feet, and tell me something. Daniel lowered himself onto the makeshift seat, hyper-aware of how surreal this moment was. A CEO in a damaged tuxedo, taking a coffee break in a Queen's garage with a woman he'd wronged. Tell you what, when's the last time you did something just because it felt right, not because it served a purpose? The question hit him like a physical blow. Daniel opened his mouth to answer, then closed it, then opened it again. Minutes passed in silence as he searched his memory for a single moment of pure, purposeless joy. Victoria watched the realization dawn on his face with something that might have been compassion. That's what I thought, she said gently. You know what's funny? You're probably one of the most successful men in this city, and I'd bet you haven't felt truly alive in years. The accuracy of her assessment left Daniel breathless. He looked around the garage, at Tommy humming while he worked, at the photos of family and friends taped to the walls, at the easy contentment that filled this simple space. How do you do it? He asked. How do you find joy in? He gestured vaguely at their surroundings. In this, Victoria's smile was warm. Because this isn't just work. It's connection. Every car that comes through here belongs to someone who needs help. Someone whose day gets better because we solve their problem. There's purpose in that. Real purpose. Daniel thought about his own work, algorithms and profit margins, quarterly reports and shareholder value. When had he last directly helped another human being? Must be nice, he said, and the longing in his voice surprised them both. It is, Victoria said, but it's also hard. Some months, we barely make ends meet. I live in a studio apartment above a Chinese restaurant, and my biggest luxury is getting takeout instead of cooking ramen. She paused. But I sleep well at night. The contrast between their lives felt like a chasm. But somehow, sitting here in the warm light of the garage, it didn't feel insurmountable. It felt like a conversation between two people who'd been missing something essential and were just beginning to recognize what it might be. Engines ready for testing, Tommy called out. Victoria, you want to do the honors? Victoria stood and moved to the Mercedes, her hand hovering over the ignition. This is the moment of truth. Either we saved it, or we find out how much a new engine costs, Daniel finished. You ready? Victoria asked. Daniel realized she wasn't just asking about the car. She was asking if he was ready for whatever came next. Success or failure, connection or disappointment. The possibility that this strange night might actually lead somewhere unexpected. I'm ready, he said, and meant it. Victoria turned the key. The Mercedes purred to life with the smooth confidence of German engineering, its engine running clean and strong. The gauge showed normal operating temperature, and the temporary radiator hose held perfectly. I'll be damned, Tommy said, shaking his head in amazement. "Victoria, you're a miracle worker." But Victoria was looking at Daniel, watching the relief and wonder play across his face as he heard his car's healthy heartbeat. For a moment, his guard was completely down, and she glimpsed the man he might have been if life had been gentler with him. "Thank you," Daniel said, and the words carried more weight than gratitude for automotive repair. "I don't know how to. What I owe you?" "Nothing," Victoria said quickly. "You don't owe me anything." But that wasn't entirely true. As they stood there in the golden garage light, both of them felt the strange pull of unfinished business. A conversation that had started with conflict, but was evolving into something neither of them quite understood yet. Daniel's phone remained mercifully silent, the 30-minute deadline temporarily forgotten. Outside, the October night continued its gentle rain. But inside Wright's Auto Repair, two people who'd started as strangers were beginning to discover they might be something else entirely. The real question was whether either of them was brave enough to find out what. "You know," Tommy said, wiping his hands one final time, "I'm gonna head home to Martha. She worries when I'm late." He gave Victoria a meaningful look. "You've got this handled, right, V?" Victoria caught the subtle matchmaking in her uncle's tone and shot him a warning glance. But Tommy was already grabbing his jacket, whistling innocently. "Nice meeting you, Daniel," Tommy said, shaking the CEO's hand. "Take care of yourself. And maybe," he glanced at Victoria with a small smile, "maybe listen to the experts next time." After Tommy left, the garage felt different, more intimate, quieter except for the gentle tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of the city. Daniel stood beside his repaired Mercedes, oddly reluctant to leave this warm bubble of honest work and unexpected connection. "I should probably go," he said, but made no move toward the car. "Probably," Victoria agreed, but she didn't move either. Instead, she walked to the radio and turned the volume down, then settled onto the edge of the workbench. "But your engine should cool for a few more minutes anyway. Just to be safe." Daniel found himself gravitating toward her, drawn by something he couldn't name. "Can I ask you something?" "Shoot. Do you ever wonder what would have happened? If your mom hadn't gotten sick, if you'd gone to MIT?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the workbench. "Every day for the first 5 years. Then I realized wondering was just another way of suffering. But you must have plans. Dreams beyond this place." "This place," Victoria said with gentle firmness, "isn't a consolation prize. It's home. It's family. It's work that matters." She looked around the garage with genuine affection. "But yes, I have dreams. I've been saving for years to expand. Add a bay for electric vehicle repair. Maybe offer classes for kids who want to learn. Show them that working with your hands isn't settling for less." Daniel heard the passion in her voice and felt something stir in his chest. When had he last talked about his work with that kind of love? "What about you?" Victoria asked. "What did you dream about before you became Daniel Hartwell, CEO?" The question caught him off guard. I don't remember dreaming about anything except success." "Nothing else?" "Come on, there had to be something." Daniel sank onto a nearby stool, surprising himself with his answer. "I wanted to be a teacher." Victoria's eyebrows rose. "Really?" "High school physics. I loved the moment when complex concepts suddenly clicked for students, when their faces lit up with understanding." Daniel's voice grew wistful. "I used to tutor kids in my neighborhood for free, just to see that moment happen." "What changed?" "My father found out. Said teaching was for people who couldn't achieve anything themselves. That I was wasting my potential on other people's children when I should be building something that mattered." Daniel's laugh was bitter. "Funny thing is, I built exactly what he wanted, and it feels like the least meaningful thing I've ever done." Victoria studied his face in the workshop's warm light, seeing past the expensive grooming to the lonely boy who'd had his dreams redirected before he was old enough to fight for them. "You know," she said quietly, "there are other ways to teach." "Like what?" Like right now. You learned to diagnose an engine problem tonight. You learned that assumptions can cost you more than money. You learned that expertise doesn't always come in the package you expect. Victoria's voice was gentle but insistent. That's teaching. Just from the other direction. Daniel felt something unlock in his chest. A recognition that maybe the evening's disasters had actually been gifts. He looked at Victoria, really looked at her, and saw not just the skilled mechanic who'd saved his car, but a woman of extraordinary grace who'd chosen kindness over resentment, wisdom over bitterness. "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" he asked. Victoria smiled. "After tonight? I think we're past worrying about embarrassment. This is the first real conversation I've had in months. Maybe years." Daniel's confession came out barely above a whisper. "I have hundreds of contacts in my phone. I attend dozens of social events. I'm surrounded by people all day long. But sitting here with you, talking about dreams and regrets, I feel more connected than I have since Patricia left." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Victoria felt her own walls beginning to shift, recognizing the echo of her own loneliness in his words. "You want to know something sad?" she said. "I almost didn't help you tonight. Not because of what you said, but because I'm tired of being invisible. Tired of people looking through me like I'm not there, or looking at me like I'm a threat." She met his eyes. "But then I heard your engine crying, and I couldn't walk away. My grandfather always said machines are honest. They don't lie about what they need." "Unlike people," Daniel said. "Unlike people," Victoria agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their shared honesty settling around them like a blanket. Outside, the rain had stopped, but neither of them seemed eager to return to their separate worlds. "Victoria," Daniel said suddenly, "what if? What if what?" He hesitated, then pushed forward. "What if I told you I've been looking for ways to invest in community programs? Real investments, not just tax write-offs or photo opportunities." Victoria's expression grew guarded. "I'd say that sounds like a very convenient revelation." "It's not convenient at all," Daniel said, and she could hear the truth in his voice. "It's terrifying, because it means admitting that everything I've built feels hollow, and I don't know how to fix that. What do you think it takes for successful people to find real meaning? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt successful on paper, but empty inside?" Victoria stood and moved to the engine, checking the coolant levels one final time. But Daniel could see she was also checking her own emotional levels, deciding how much more vulnerability she could risk with this man who'd entered her life through conflict and might disappear just as suddenly. "Your car's ready," she said finally. "Temperature's stable, hoses holding. You should be able to make it anywhere you need to go." Daniel heard the gentle dismissal in her voice and felt panic rise in his throat. What if I don't want to go anywhere else? The question surprised them both. Victoria turned to face him, and in her expression, he saw the same confusion he felt. The recognition that something unexpected had happened between them, something that defied the logic of their separate lives. "Daniel," she said carefully, "we've known each other for 3 hours. 3 hours that started with you yelling at me for trying to help. I know how this looks, how crazy this is." Daniel stood up, his expensive shoes silent on the garage floor. "But I also know that I feel more myself right now than I have in years. That your grandfather's photo on that workbench tells me more about who you are than most people reveal in months of acquaintance." Victoria felt her heart do something dangerous. It began to hope. "And what does it tell you? That you come from love. That you learned to work with your hands from someone who saw your potential and nurtured it. That you've spent your life fixing things, not just engines, but situations, problems, maybe even people." Daniel's voice grew softer. "And that you're probably the strongest person I've ever met." The words landed like a prayer answered, like recognition Victoria had been waiting for without realizing it. She looked at this man, disheveled now, grease under his fingernails, his corporate armor stripped away, and saw someone she hadn't expected to find. "Your car's ready," she repeated, but her voice had lost its finality. "I know," Daniel said, "but I'm not." They stood facing each other across the garage bay, both aware they were at a crossroads. Behind Daniel, his repaired Mercedes waited to carry him back to his world of boardrooms and galas. Behind Victoria, the familiar comfort of tools and routine promised safety from the dangerous possibility blooming between them. "One question," Victoria said. "If I asked you to stay, not for the car, not for business, just to stay, what would you say?" Daniel looked at her, at the vulnerability she was offering him like a gift, and realized that his answer would determine more than just how this evening ended. "I'd say I've spent 38 years leaving," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time I learned how to stay." The smile that spread across Victoria's face was worth more than any deal Daniel had ever closed. They might have stayed in that perfect moment forever, Daniel and Victoria discovering something neither had expected to find, if his phone hadn't shattered the silence with its sharp, insistent ring. Patricia's name flashed on the screen again, and this time, Daniel's hand moved automatically to answer before he could stop himself. "Patricia? What's—" "Daniel, thank God." His ex-wife's voice was tight with panic. "I've been calling for hours. Have you seen the news?" "What news?" Daniel stepped away from Victoria, his corporate instincts kicking in despite the grease on his hands and the warmth still radiating from their conversation. "Someone filmed you tonight. Outside the museum. You're all over social media. Tech billionaire attacks black woman helping with his car. It's everywhere, Daniel. The video makes it look like." Daniel's blood turned to ice. "Like what?" "Like you're exactly the kind of privileged racist everyone assumes you are. Your board is in crisis mode. The mayor's office is fielding calls. The charity you were supposed to support tonight has issued a statement distancing themselves from you." Victoria watched Daniel's face transform as Patricia's words hit him like physical blows. The man who'd been opening up to her moments before disappeared behind a mask of corporate damage control. She could only hear his side of the conversation, but the change in his posture told her everything she needed to know. "How bad?" Daniel asked, his voice flat. "Hartwell Industries stock is down 12% in after-hours trading. #PrivilegeCEO is trending. Your investors are scheduled for an emergency call tomorrow morning." Patricia's voice softened slightly. "Daniel, I know you. I know your heart. But this video, it doesn't show your heart. It shows a rich white man screaming at a black woman who was trying to help him." Daniel closed his eyes, the garage suddenly feeling too small, too warm, too honest for the reality crashing down around him. "I have to go. Where are you?" "I can help with damage control, but—" "I'm handling it," Daniel said, ending the call. Victoria had heard enough one-sided conversation to understand. She stood slowly, her expression carefully neutral, but Daniel could see the walls rebuilding themselves behind her eyes. "So," she said quietly, "I'm trending." "Victoria, it's not." "Not what?" "Not a big deal that your reputation is more important than what actually happened here tonight." Her voice remained calm, but Daniel could hear the hurt underneath. "Not a problem that I'm now the face of whatever damage this does to your empire? That's not fair. I didn't ask for this to be filmed." "No, but you did ask for this to happen." Victoria's words were precise, surgical. "You made a choice to assume the worst about me. You made a choice to publicly humiliate someone who was trying to help you. The cameras just recorded what was already true." Daniel felt panic rising in his throat, not just about his company or his reputation, but about the connection he could feel slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. "Please," he said, "don't let this change what happened here tonight." Victoria studied his face, and Daniel saw the exact moment she made her decision. It was like watching a door close. "What happened here tonight?" she asked. "A rich man got his car fixed. That's all." "That's not all, and you know it." Daniel stepped toward her, desperate. "We connected. We shared things. We what, Daniel? Victoria's voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath now. We bonded over coffee and shared trauma. You think 3 hours erases a lifetime of being treated exactly like you treated me. I apologized for that. You did, and I believed you meant it. But now your real world is calling, and I can see you calculating. How much is this connection worth against your board's approval? How much is my friendship worth against 12% of your stock value? The accuracy of her assessment hit Daniel like a physical blow because she was right. Part of his mind was already spinning scenarios, calculating damage control, weighing the cost of being associated with this evening's controversy. That's not who I want to be, he said desperately. But it's who you are. Victoria moved toward the garage bay, putting distance between them. You said it yourself, you became your father. Men like that don't change overnight, because they meet someone who makes them feel human for a few hours. Daniel's phone was buzzing with text messages now. His assistant, his PR team, board members demanding explanations. Each notification felt like a chain pulling him back toward the life he'd built, away from the possibility Victoria represented. I have to deal with this, he said, hating himself for the words even as they left his mouth. I know. Victoria's smile was sad, but not surprised. It's what I expected. What does that mean? It means men like you always leave, Daniel. You get what you need, your car fixed, your crisis solved, your momentary taste of feeling real. And then you go back to your actual life. I was foolish to think tonight might be different. The words cut deeper than any business crisis ever had. Daniel saw himself through her eyes. Another powerful man who'd taken what he needed and was already preparing to discard the person who'd given it to him. That's not what this is, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Victoria picked up her tools, her movements sharp and efficient. Your reputation is in crisis. Being associated with me, right now, is professional suicide. So you'll go back to your world, make your statements, distance yourself from the unfortunate incident with the helpful stranger. Maybe even donate some money to automotive training programs for underprivileged youth. Really complete the redemption arc. Each word was a knife, made worse by the fact that Daniel could see the exact path she was describing laid out before him like a roadmap he'd followed a dozen times before. I won't do that to you, he said. You already are. Victoria's voice finally cracked, just slightly. You're standing there calculating the cost of knowing me, and we both know what the math says. Daniel's phone rang again, his head of PR. The real world demanding its pound of flesh. Answer it, Victoria said. Handle your crisis. Save your empire. Daniel stared at the phone, then at Victoria, feeling like he was being torn in half. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, hung in the balance. 800 employees depended on his company. Investors trusted him with their futures. The responsible choice was clear. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know, Victoria said, and the forgiveness in her voice somehow made it worse. I knew this was how it would end the moment your phone started ringing. Daniel answered the call, stepping away from her as his PR team's urgent voices filled his ear. Within minutes, he was deep in crisis management mode, calculating responses, crafting statements, protecting the empire he'd built from the tremors of one honest moment. When he finally hung up and turned around, Victoria was gone. The garage felt cavernous without her presence, the warm light suddenly harsh and unforgiving. On the workbench where they'd sat and shared their truths, she'd left a handwritten receipt. Engine repair and coolant flush, $0. Some things can't be paid for. Daniel crumpled the paper in his fist, hating himself more than he'd ever hated anyone. Through the garage's open bay, he could see his Mercedes waiting for him, perfectly repaired and ready to carry him back to his golden cage. He climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a long moment, breathing in the smell of new coolant and temporary fixes. On the passenger seat, His phone displayed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. His entire world demanding explanations, reassurances, and the careful reconstruction of his image. Daniel Hartwell, CEO, started the engine and pulled out of Wright's Auto Repair, leaving behind the best 3 hours he'd experienced in years. But as he drove through the October night toward damage control and corporate salvation, one thought echoed in his mind with devastating clarity. Victoria had been right about everything, and he'd chosen his empire over his heart, exactly like she'd predicted he would. The worst part wasn't that he'd hurt her, though that knowledge felt like shattered glass in his chest. The worst part was that he'd proven every cynical assumption she'd ever made about men like him. He'd become exactly who she'd expected him to be. The Hartwell Industries boardroom at 6 a.m. felt like a tribunal. Daniel sat at the head of the polished table, facing 12 pairs of eyes that ranged from concerned to furious. The viral video played on the conference room screen for the third time. 30 seconds of footage that captured him at his absolute worst, yelling at a woman whose only crime had been trying to help. 18%, announced CFO Margaret Harrison, her voice clinical. Stocks down 18% since the video hit social media. That's $140 million in market cap, vanished overnight. Board member Charles Webb leaned forward, his face grim. Daniel, I've known you for 15 years. This isn't you. But perception is reality in our business. And right now, the perception is that you're everything wrong with corporate America. Daniel stared at the frozen frame on the screen. His own face, twisted with anger and privilege, while Victoria stood with her hands raised in surrender. The image made him sick. The PR team has a strategy, announced his head of communications, sliding a thick folder across the table. Full apology tour. You were under stress, caught off guard, deeply regret your reaction. We've already drafted statements emphasizing your company's commitment to diversity and inclusion. There's a plan to make substantial donations to several civil rights organizations. And the woman? Daniel asked quietly. We're handling it. Financial compensation for her time and trouble. NDA to prevent further statements to the press. Clean and contained. The words hit Daniel like physical blows. Victoria, reduced to a problem to be managed, paid off, silenced. The woman who'd shared her grandfather's story, who'd saved his engine with skills that had taken decades to master, who'd seen through his armor to something real underneath. They wanted to erase her like she was a computational error. No, Daniel said. The room fell silent. Sir, his PR director asked carefully. No NDAs. No payoffs. No trying to make this go away by buying her silence. Margaret Harrison's voice turned sharp. Daniel, you're not thinking clearly. The company has to come first. 800 employees depend on. 800 employees depend on me making the right choice, Daniel interrupted, and for the first time in hours, his voice carried real conviction. Not the profitable choice. Not the safe choice. The right choice. Charles Webb leaned back in his chair. What are you saying? Daniel looked around the table at these people who'd helped him build an empire, who trusted him with their futures, who expected him to protect what they'd all worked to create. Everything logical told him to follow their plan. Apologize safely, pay quietly, move on strategically. But Victoria's voice echoed in his memory. Some things can't be paid for. I'm saying I need to fix this the right way, Daniel said. Not the corporate way. The human way. He stood up, the motion sudden enough to startle several board members. Cancel the PR strategy. Cancel the damage control. Cancel everything. Daniel, you can't be serious, Margaret said. Your entire career is built on a foundation that's been slowly killing me for 20 years. Daniel's confession shocked even himself. Last night, a woman I wronged saved my car and showed me more grace than I deserved. She saw who I really am underneath all this. He gestured at the boardroom, the corporate machinery, the empire of isolation he'd constructed. And for 3 hours, I remembered what it felt like to be human. The room erupted in concerned voices, but Daniel held up his hand for silence. "I'm going to find her," he said simply. "I'm going to apologize publicly, honestly, and without conditions. I'm going to ask her forgiveness, not because PR demands it, but because she deserves it." "And if she refuses?" Charles asked. "If this makes everything worse?" Daniel thought about Victoria's resignation when he'd first yelled at her, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to count. He thought about how her face had lit up when she talked about her dreams for the garage, and how it had closed when his phone had pulled him back into his world of calculated responses. "Then at least I'll know I tried to be the man she saw in me for those 3 hours," he said, "instead of the man I've been for the past 20 years. Margaret Harrison's voice was deadly quiet. "Daniel, if you do this, if you make this about feelings instead of strategy, you could lose everything. The company, your position, your reputation." "What reputation?" Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "As what? A successful CEO who can't maintain a real relationship? A wealthy man who's too afraid to trust anyone? A leader who's forgotten how to connect with the people he supposedly serves?" He moved toward the door, then turned back to face the room full of advisors who'd helped him build his golden prison. 24 hours ago, I thought I had everything I wanted. Then a woman I'd never met saw my car was about to break down and tried to help, and I attacked her for it. She could have walked away, let my engine destroy itself, watched me suffer the consequences of my own ignorance. Instead, she saved my car and spent 3 hours teaching me things I didn't know I needed to learn. Daniel's voice grew stronger with each word. "So yes, I might lose everything. But maybe what I think of as everything isn't worth keeping if it requires me to be someone I hate." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Charles Webb spoke. "What do you need from us?" Daniel felt a surge of gratitude for the old man who'd mentored him, who was offering support even while disagreeing with his choice. "Time," Daniel said. "And if this goes badly, if the company suffers because of my decision, help me find a way to protect our employees that doesn't require protecting me." Margaret was already typing on her tablet. "I'll convene an emergency succession planning session. Just in case." "Thank you." Daniel paused at the door. "I know this seems crazy. Maybe it is. But for the first time in years, I'm choosing to do something because it feels right, not because it serves a strategy." "Daniel," Charles called out as he reached for the door handle. "What if she won't see you?" Daniel thought about Victoria's eyes in that last moment before his phone had pulled him away. The recognition of a pattern she'd seen too many times before, the protective walls sliding back into place. "Then I'll have learned something else she was trying to teach me," he said. "That some damage can't be undone. But I have to try." As Daniel left the boardroom behind, his phone began buzzing with new notifications. More coverage, more commentary, more voices telling him who he should be and how he should respond. But for the first time in his adult life, he turned the phone off completely. The elevator descended 43 floors, carrying him away from the empire he'd built and toward a woman who'd shown him a different way to live. He had no plan, no strategy, no guarantee that Victoria would even listen to what he had to say. All he had was the memory of her smile when he'd said he'd learned how to stay, and the devastating knowledge that he'd immediately proven he hadn't learned anything at all. The lobby doors opened onto a crisp October morning, and Daniel Hartwell stepped out into the sunlight, ready to discover whether redemption was possible or whether some choices, once made, echoed forever. Behind him, his empire held its breath, waiting to see if their leader would save himself or sacrifice everything for the chance to save something more important: his soul. The taxi ride to Queens felt like traveling to another planet, one where his name meant nothing and his wealth couldn't buy him the only thing he truly wanted: another chance. Victoria was under the hood of a 2018 Prius when she heard the taxi pull up outside Wright's Auto Repair. She'd arrived at dawn, needing the comfort of familiar work to quiet the storm in her chest. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face in those final moments, the way he'd looked at his phone like it held his entire world, which she supposed it had. She didn't look up when footsteps approached the garage bay. Another customer, another engine to diagnose, another day of honest work that would help her forget about millionaire CEOs who made her believe, for 3 dangerous hours, that maybe the world could be different than she'd learned it was. "Excuse me?" Victoria's hands stilled on the Prius's battery connection. That voice, careful now, stripped of its earlier arrogance, carrying something that sounded almost like fear. She straightened slowly and turned around. Daniel stood at the edge of the garage bay, no longer the polished executive from last night. His expensive suit had been replaced with jeans and a simple white button-down shirt. His hair was slightly mussed, his face shadowed with exhaustion, and in his hands he held something that made Victoria's breath catch. A single red rose and a printed photograph. "Before you say anything," Daniel said quickly, "I know I have no right to be here. I know I proved every terrible assumption you've ever made about men like me. But I need to show you something." Victoria crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "I've seen the video, Daniel. Half the internet has seen the video." "Not that." Daniel held up the photograph. "This." Curious despite herself, Victoria took the picture. It showed a much younger Daniel, maybe 19 or 20, sitting cross-legged on a classroom floor surrounded by a diverse group of high school students. He was holding up a physics equation on a whiteboard, and every face in the photo radiated joy and engagement. At the bottom, someone had written, "Mr. H's Free Saturday Physics Club. You made science fun. Westside Community Center, 2009-inch." Victoria looked from the photo to Daniel's face, seeing something she hadn't expected. Proof that the man she'd glimpsed last night had existed long before his corporate armor had buried him. "I found this in my apartment this morning," Daniel said quietly. "I'd forgotten I even had it. Forgotten that version of myself ever existed." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "But you reminded me. In 3 hours, you reminded me of who I used to be before I became who I thought I had to be." Victoria set the photo on the workbench, her fingers lingering on its edges. "Daniel, that's beautiful, but..." "I resigned." The words stopped her cold. "What?" "This morning. In front of the board, in front of the media, in front of everyone who expected me to choose my empire over my integrity." Daniel's voice was steady now, certain. "I told them that a woman named Victoria Wright had shown me more about leadership in one evening than I'd learned in 20 years of business school, and that any company that couldn't see the value in that kind of wisdom didn't deserve my leadership." Victoria stared at him, her mind reeling. "You resigned? From your own company?" "I stepped down as CEO. Charles Webb is taking over. He's better at it than I ever was anyway. I'm retaining a small stake, enough to live comfortably, but I'm done pretending to be someone I'm not." "Daniel, that's..." Victoria struggled for words. "That's insane. You threw away everything you built because of one night." "No," Daniel said, stepping closer. "I threw away everything I built because it was built on the wrong foundation. Because I'd rather be broke and honest than rich and empty. Because you showed me what it looks like to live with integrity, and I can't unsee that now." Victoria felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "What are you saying?" Daniel took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine everything. "I'm saying I want to learn from you. Not just about engines, but about purpose. About finding joy in work that matters. About being the kind of person who helps when they see someone struggling, instead of assuming the worst." He held up the rose, his hand trembling slightly. "I'm saying that in 3 hours, you changed my life completely, and I was too scared to protect what we found together. But I'm not scared anymore." Victoria felt tears threatening, her heart doing dangerous things in her chest. "Daniel, I can't be your redemption project. I can't be the noble cause that makes you feel better about your privilege. That's not what this is. Daniel's voice was firm, certain. This is me, standing in your garage at 9 in the morning, covered in newsprint and public scandal, asking if you'd be willing to teach a very slow learner how to live like you live, how to work like you work, how to love like you love. The word love hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross so soon. Victoria felt her breath catch. You don't know me well enough to love me, she said quietly. You're right, Daniel admitted. But I know you well enough to want to spend the rest of my life learning how. Have you ever met someone who changed your entire perspective in just one conversation? Tell us about it in the comments. We believe in the power of unexpected connections. Victoria looked at this man who'd entered her world through conflict and was now offering to stay through choice. She thought about her grandfather's voice. Baby girl, the best repairs take time, patience, and faith that something broken can be made whole again. If I said yes, she said carefully, if I was crazy enough to believe you mean this, what exactly are you proposing? Daniel smiled, and Victoria saw the teacher from the photograph finally breaking through. Partnership. Real partnership. I have resources you could use. Capital for that expansion you mentioned. Connections to help you build the youth program you dream about. But more than that. He paused, vulnerable. I have a lot to learn about what meaningful work looks like, and I can't think of a better teacher. And personally, Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. Personally, I'd like to spend every day for the rest of my life proving that the man you saw in me last night is real. That he's stronger than the corporate robot I became. That he's worthy of a woman who fixes things instead of breaking them. Victoria felt the last of her resistance crumble. Daniel Hartwell, are you asking me out while standing in my garage, covered in yesterday's scandal? Victoria, right. I'm asking you to take a chance on someone who's finally learned the difference between being successful and being alive. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd given up an empire for the possibility of authenticity, who'd chosen her world over his own when everything logical said the opposite. One condition, she said finally. Anything. You really learn. Not just enough to feel good about yourself, but enough to be useful. I don't need a partner who's playing dress-up as a mechanic. I need someone who understands that this work matters. Daniel nodded solemnly. I want to understand. All of it. Victoria smiled, and Daniel felt his heart restart like an engine coming back to life. In that case, she said, moving toward him with deliberate slowness, I suppose we should start with the basics. When she kissed him, there in the golden morning light of Wright's Auto Repair, Daniel tasted possibility. Coffee and courage, second chances and new beginnings. Her calloused hands cupped his face gently, and he realized this was what Patricia had been trying to tell him for years. Love wasn't a performance to be perfected, but a choice to be made over and over again. They broke apart, both breathing hard, both aware they were standing at the beginning of something unprecedented. So, Victoria said, her voice slightly unsteady, ready for your first real lesson? Daniel looked around the garage that had become the site of his salvation, then back at the woman who'd shown him how to save more than engines. I've been ready my whole life, he said. I just didn't know what I was waiting for. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the expanded Wright's Auto Repair, teaching a group of teenagers from the community center how to change oil while Victoria worked on the garage's first Tesla. His hands were permanently stained now. His expensive watch had been replaced with a simple timepiece that could survive honest work, and every morning he woke up excited about the day ahead. The viral video still existed, would always exist, but its meaning had transformed. Instead of a symbol of privilege and prejudice, it had become the origin story of Wright Hartwell Community Automotive, a garage that trained young mechanics, fixed cars for struggling families at cost, and proved every day that redemption was possible when two people chose to build something together. Mr. H, called out Jasmine, one of his favorite students, a 16-year-old whose natural mechanical instincts reminded him of Victoria. The brake pads are making that sound you taught us about. Daniel grinned, wiping his hands on the coveralls that had replaced his $1,000 suits. Which sound? And what does that tell us? As he guided Jasmine through the diagnostic process, Victoria looked up from her work and caught his eye. The smile they shared was worth more than any empire he'd ever built. Later that evening, as they closed the garage together, Daniel pulled Victoria close in the doorway where they'd first learned to trust each other. "Any regrets?" she asked, her head resting against his shoulder. Daniel looked out at the street where their love story had begun with conflict and grown into something beautiful through choice, patience, and the courage to be vulnerable. "Only one," he said, kissing the top of her head. "That it took me 38 years to find you." Victoria smiled, thinking of her grandfather's words about the best repairs taking time, patience, and faith. Some things, she'd learned, were worth the wait. "Good thing I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Good thing," Daniel agreed, and as they turned off the garage lights together, both of them knew they'd found something more precious than any treasure either had imagined possible. Love. Real, honest, transformative love that had grown from conflict into connection, from judgment into joy, from two broken hearts learning to beat in harmony. Some engines, they'd discovered, were worth saving, and some people were worth the long, careful work of love.